Hi there, I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. Welcome to the newsroom, which is my mostly weekly, most Fridays live stream. So, last time we did this last week, I talked a bit about imagination and as a power rather than as just something we do for fun or something that kids do, and how important it is. You may want to listen to that live stream. I record all these so that they're available in YouTube after. You just go to my channel and click live, and you can see them that way. So, in that live stream, I mentioned that we were going to do a little piece on research, which is today. And I'd like to go through a little of what science says about the importance of both imagination and also play, especially as we're adults. I should mention too that on the same page as this video will go up, I put a link to a blog at my website, chalkwist.com. And if you go to that article and you scroll about halfway down, maybe a little bit more, there is a link that you can download, a PDF file, and it summarizes the research I'm about to go over. So if you want that in writing and you want all the citations and all that stuff, there you go. Part of why I'm doing this, it's interesting to know, and I try to keep up on what science says about the imagination. So it's just cool to know all that. But over the years, I've run into a lot of people who need something funded, or they want to justify some kind of a class or a business program or what have you, or do training in the corporate world that's imagination based. And hard-headed people say, let's see the science, let's see the facts. So I'm hoping this will be useful to you in those and other capacities as well. Now, last time, and this is a very brief recap. So last time I mentioned that imagination, if you look it up in the dictionary, it says something like, I'm thinking of Merriam-Webster, for example, that it's an act or power of forming a mental image of something not present. Not terribly helpful. I think it's restrictive, as I mentioned last time. And imagination as a power, as an activity, is not only more foundational than that. It's not just thinking up mental pictures, but it's actually conceiving something that's not in the room or maybe doesn't yet exist, something that the senses can't see. So it's much wider than that. It's not just a visual representation. Obviously, blind people imagine. So we need to think of imagination more as something that's foundational for all of our capabilities. There's probably not a single human activity you can think of that doesn't have imagination mixed in with it somewhere. So that's something to realize. And one more point before I go through the science here. And by the way, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat for questions. Feel free to type them in. We'll do a Q&A at the end. But one more point I'd like to make, and this is a bit of a recap too. So when we think of different things that we might use interchangeably, like imagination, fantasy, creativity, innovation, stuff like that, they're not exactly interchangeable. They refer mostly to differences in the sequence of when we're up to something creative. So for instance, I always put imagination first because it's primal. It is foundational. Everything rests on imagination, right? So that comes first. When we are using it, especially playfully, that's fantasy. When our fantasies lead us to put things together that weren't assembled that way anymore or before, then we're talking about creativity. We're creating something new. And if that makes a difference somehow in the outer world, if we use our creativity to build new structures, new inventions, new whatever it is, then we can talk about innovation. So oftentimes in business circles and others too, I'm thinking of the military, which I mentioned last time, many different areas focus on innovation and why it's powerful and necessary and how to encourage it and things like that. But they're focusing on the tail end of the process, which is why when you look through the scientific literature, at least now, there's not tons of studies on imagination. They're mostly on creativity, innovation, and all that. But I really wanted to focus on imagination because it's primary. So let's look at that, and I'm going to bring in some brain science here too, right at the very beginning, so that you have that. So as I go, I'll talk a little bit about what these mean. So there are studies going back to 2001, and there's been several of them, where they look at the brain as it's imagining. And of course, they say that a crucial function of the brain, and I'm looking right at a study here, one of several, is to use stored information to imagine, to simulate and predict possible future events. And that in the brain, this is also linked to memory. So, what we're starting to see already in this very first study is that imagination isn't this little capability that's stuck like over here or under here or something. The whole brain's involved in it, basically. Some structures more than others, obviously. But we see that again and again when we look at the neuroscience, that imagination is something that basically wakes up the whole brain. And the emphasis on prediction is something that pops up a lot in the study literature. And part of why it does is it's driven by a thought toward evolution, which is, why do we have this capability to begin with? Why did we evolve it? And as I mentioned last time, one of the reasons from that perspective is that it allows us to predict things before we actually do them, which could be in some cases dangerous or even fatal. So the people who hang back and go, here's some ways that this might not go well, and then they survive. So we're their descendants, right? So the neural networks that are involved in mental representation, which is a part of imagining, are very complex, and they're widespread in the brain as well. And one thing about the brain that's interesting is it can switch modes between different representational profiles as needed. So imagination in the brain is also highly versatile. The brain can flip to different parts of it and say, now this, now that. And so that's another way in which imagination wakes up the brain. The brain isn't passive in the sense of, I'm thinking of old philosophers, the British empiricists, who they made everything sound a bit passive when they said, well, we absorb some ideas and sense perceptions, and then that's when we get active and put them all together. But in alignment with later philosophy, actually, I'm thinking phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, and others, it doesn't seem to be that way when we study the brain. It's more that instead of waiting to be activated by sensations, the brain creates predictions to fit them into, and that approximate relative futures. And so it draws actively on analogies, representations, pulls things from memory. So even in dealing with sense perceptions that are incoming, the brain is already in an imaginary frame, right? So that's something to be aware of. And I'm drawing on, I should have maybe, I might slow us down too much if I mention all the references. So Schlegel, I was talking about him previously, and then there's Barr, 2007, there's Hassabis, McGuire, and a number of others. You know what, I think I'll just skip that part for this because it'll take too much time. But if you go to that document that I left you a link to, you can find all this. So when we look at remembering past events and also imagining possible future ones, they share a neurology that supports each other. So now we bring in memory. Memory has a lot to do with imagining, and they seem to support and strengthen one another. But also, there's one set of brain regions that do tend to be more active when we envision the future than when we think about the past, which is interesting. So when you're just mulling over stuff that happened before, that's one set of structures. But when you're imagining forward into the future, that's left lateral premotor cortex, that's right posterior cerebellum, and other structures start firing up when you do that. That's research from 2007, 2003, and even earlier. And when we do that, entire subsystems in the brain show more activity than when we're imagining just the past in simple recall, or if we're doing rote task completion. So, which is, I think, important for education. If it's just about memorizing facts or memorizing something that happened previously, less of the brain seems to be involved in that than when we're bringing imagination into it. In terms of envisioning the future, remembering the past, conceiving the viewpoint of others, and some forms of navigation, these all reflect workings of the same core brain network, and that includes the frontal and medial temporal systems that are traditionally associated with planning and with certain kinds of episodic memory. So, again, we're seeing how much of the brain is involved in imagining, that it's integrative, it's actually on a neurological level. Future oriented planning also results in especially good memory relative to other memory tasks, which is interesting. So, we remember better by being futurists. Anticipation can be more emotionally evocative than retrospection, than remembering stuff in the past, especially when the anticipated future is expected to be positive. Now, think about how much information we absorb about disastrous planetary climate change. And it's stuff we need to know. But when it's only that, when it's only about tipping points and this and all of that tends to light up the brain less than trying to understand how we can make something good come of this disaster and anticipate futures where we actually handle things. That tends to get more emotional backing than the other. So that's important to know. And that leads directly to this next point, which is that according to other studies, people who are convinced that they can cope effectively with stress, remember past events, and imagine future events in greater episodic detail than people who have difficulties coping with stress. So, those who think they can cope with stress tend to remember better and imagine possible futures better. So, that's important. Imagination, of course, is not just visual, it's also motor and somatic, it's not just mental. In terms of creativity, to bring that in. So, creativity requires vividness, originality, innovation of imagination, especially when it's linked to applying the creative works and also learning about what it takes to make them. Creativity joins deliberate focus with spontaneous imagination. And here I'll mention something psychological that I've often noticed, which is I'll use an example from writing. So, when my students and my consulting clients are on task with something that they're writing, and then all of a sudden they get derailed, they have all kinds of block or whatever we want to call it, right? 99 times out of 100, they're trying to edit while they're writing, they're trying to control what's actually happening. Now, some of us, especially those of us with a lot of experience writing, can do both at the same time. So, like I popped out an article for medium.com like 2 or 3 days ago, and it was on imagine knowing, which we talked about last time, imagination used as a form of knowledge. So it took me, I guess, about 3 hours to write. It's about 2,500 words or so. And I was able to edit as I went because I do this a lot. But if you have some sort of trouble or stickiness about getting things down, you need to try making them separate processes. So the study says creativity joins the two, and that's exactly right. But there's two to be joined. So in the draft stage, anything goes. You can write notes to yourself, you can write whatever you please, right? There has to be a spontaneity in order for creativity to function. If it's locked down too much, nothing happens. So think about the number of people who immediately go to, how will this make us money? How will this provide a concrete solution, right? So they're strangling the baby in its bed. they're killing imagination before it has a chance to grow up and do something. So they need to be processes that both deserve respect and space, psychic space, right? So here's the next study. Imagery provides a crucial linkage of motivation in terms of going after goals. And this is something that the coaching world has noticed. So when you imagine how you want something to be for you because you're focused on an important task, that tends to harness your motivation better than simply trying to do it or to just plan for it. Daydreaming, super important for preparing for the future. There's a couple of studies that talk about this. Daydreaming, right? The epitome of what some people think of as laziness. Unstructured time, absolutely necessary. And there's more and more articles coming out about this. I notice when I look for them myself. Here's something even more from the world of science, which is that the more advanced a scientist is in their career, the more they bring imagination to bear on their work. Interesting. So the more years of experience they have doing science, the more imaginative they tend to be. There are exceptions, but the epitome of this is Einstein, right? Who was just doing thought experiments right and left, and they should have been called imagination experiments. They weren't just thought. And he was imagining things like running downhill faster than light. That was partly what gave him the key to working out special relativity theory. So he's one of many examples. A couple more studies here on this. Imagining threats in a safe environment until one is calm is just as effective in helping someone face anxious things in the real world in terms of cognitive behavioral extinction regimes. So, what this sounds like in plain English, there are cognitive behavioral psychology interventions, certain kinds of mostly mental interventions, where you imagine or you think about a little bit of what frightens you. Like if you're getting over a phobia or you have to do some public speaking and you're scared to, or whatever it is. And so you imagine it a little bit at a time, right? What this study is saying is don't just think about it, but actually imagine it. Imagination is just as effective as those regimes in helping you confront whatever it is that you're afraid of. And finally, imagination actually participates in neuroplasticity. It helps the brain rewire itself. Imagination, imagining, fantasizing, creating, rewire your brain, hopefully in a good way. So that's it for imagining. Let me talk a little bit about the other part of the title of this this presentation. I'm going to talk about adult play. Let's see here. Not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'll move on. Feel free to put some in. So what's the research say about adult play? Because I hope we know that play isn't just for kids. Adult play enhances humorousness, makes you funnier, cheerfulness, lack of inhibition, expressiveness, other directedness. It helps you understand other people and work with them and play with them. And intellectuality, creativity. Play not only does all those good things, it's intrinsically rewarding above and beyond the practicalities and the payoffs. Play is a little bit like imagination itself, where when we demand that it produce a tangible product, we tend to shut it down. So in my writings, you'll start to see pretty soon, I'm trying to think of if I've mentioned this before. I don't think I have, but I'm using a term, imaginal liberty. And in part, what that refers to, and it applies to play as well, is to let the imagination do what it wants to do, what it needs to do, without completely locking it down to some kind of agenda that we have. It needs to be able to roam free, to come up with what it wants to come up with. And then we bring in the consideration of applying it, right? Similar to the writing example I gave. Daydreaming and fantasy, according to another study, enhance our everyday problem-solving abilities, as well as our aesthetic enjoyment of creative novels and dramas that are built around characters' private thoughts. So, in other words, reading novels, watching films, anything that deals with fictional characters tends to, especially when we daydream about them, enhance our problem-solving abilities, as well as give us some appreciation for the media that these come from. So I can speak to this directly. And I grew up in a violent home. occasionally violent home. And when I felt scared, sometimes I would ask myself as a boy, what would James Kirk do in a situation like this? And it helped calm me down a little bit and suggest some alternatives for dealing with a basically impossible situation. Next study, play decreases stress in young adults. A couple of studies say this actually. Play decreases stress in young adults. I wish I had played more as a young adult. I've played my whole life, but I remember times in young adulthood when this would have been really good medicine. When you're a young adult, you tend to take yourself very seriously, take everything very seriously. Playfulness in adults increases life satisfaction. It makes your lifestyle more active, and it helps with physical well-being as well. All good things. A short way of saying that might be that play as an adult makes you happier and healthier. Play increases work satisfaction and productivity. And to use a particular example of play, improv theater activity can enhance organizational creativity. So let's get some more improv in the workplace, as well as other forms of play. Play and humor increase romantic attractiveness. Play and humor are helpful in medicine and psychotherapy. And let me pause to relate an anecdote. Some years ago, when Linda Bizel and I were putting together our edited volume collection of chapters on ecotherapy, so establishing healing relations with nature, not necessarily going out for extended trips, but just more consciously interacting with the natural world. We got a lot of really good contributions. The book was published in, I think it was 2008, and has been used a lot since then. And so one of the people we tried to get to write for us was Patch Adams, the doctor. And, I knew that he combined play and medicine, and I knew about the Gesundheit Institute, which he was often fundraising for. And, but I was able to have a better sense of it by talking to him on the phone at one point. And so at one point I said, what is it like to have you as a doctor? And I said, that's not related to the book project. I'm just curious, you don't have to answer if you don't want to. And he said, are you mobile or immobile? And I said, let's say I'm immobile. I'm stuck in bed. He goes, oh, that's great. So I'd come into your room and I would look in your journal. I would open all your drawers. I would look at what you wear. I would find out as much as I can about you by just ransacking your room so that we could play together and be adults together playing. And then I'd wheel you outside because nature in some ways is the best medicine. So we would do some stuff outside as well. And just by hearing him talk about it, I got a sense of what these studies are pointing to, that how helpful play can really be in medicine for adults as well as kids. So also brings benefits to clinical work on depression, gambling disorder, other issues. Playful parents tend to raise playful children who become playful adults. So it tends to run in families. Play can help conflict resolution. It is intercultural. It crosses cultural boundaries. It's transmittable. It brings a spirit of experimentation, a willingness to take risks, including, according to one study, risks in higher education. It is useful for participating in the design of urban environments. And it's also worth noting that adults play strategy games of one kind or another in every society. So this is something that's probably universally found. And a couple of last ones here, or one last one actually. So there was a review of research that showed that laughter decreases levels of cortisol, which is associated sometimes with stress. It's a hormone that floods our body when we're getting ready for some kind of intense action. It's also implicated in depression sometimes. So laughter decreases that, and epinephrine growth hormone. It's a major dopamine catabolite. It reverses the stress response is another way of saying all this. So there's a theoretical review on this called "The Therapeutic Benefits of Laughter and Mental Health." It's worth looking at. That came out in 2016. So there is our research review. Let me make a couple of comments. And like I said earlier, if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Now, there tends to be in our culture a kind of instrumentalist mentality that I mentioned a little bit earlier, where we're always often very eager to see how to make something practical. So part of what I hope I've just spoken to in mentioning this research is that play and imagination are very practical in many ways. But I want to move a notch beyond that. And this is something that I and other people have written about just to get you thinking about a deeper level of imagination and play. And it's this, that oftentimes characters who show up in our dreams and fantasies have their own opinions about things. Many authors have mentioned this. Ursula K. Le Guin said, I did not invent Earthsea, I discovered it. Tolkien had characters pop up while he was writing The Lord of the Rings, and he kept writing to figure out what they wanted to say. Roger Zelazny talks about this, many other people. So it's as though the characters refuse to just be fictional in the sense that we make them up. They're fictional in a deeper sense. Jung would say, Carl Jung, that they are actually reflective of the almost magical power of the unconscious to take any kind of material, any kind of experience, and turn it into a character who can talk to us. So one way of understanding this psychologically is that our fictional characters are actually embodying our unconscious. And our unconscious doesn't always see things the way our conscious mind does. In fact, its view can be more comprehensive. And there are many times, and I've written about some of these and talked about these, where I have a dream that, for instance, warns me about something before I'm going to make a decision. And the dream characters show up and say, you bet you need to be careful of this, right? Or the other way. So they'll show up and say, oh, here's an opportunity over here. You need to pay more attention to this. So as Jung found out, and he wrote about this in his red and black books. His black books are his journal, which, by the way, I teach an entire course on at Young Platform. He wrote about how these different characters would show up in his imagination and they would tell him things that he disagreed with, only to find out later that they were right. So that's an amazing capability when you think about it. I'm not sure that's even the right word because it's not a capability of the conscious mind. The conscious mind can work creatively with these characters, figures, beings who pop up, but they don't come from it. They come from a wider space. So that's something to think about, that when you encounter contrary characters in fantasy, in your ordinary daydreaming, at night in your dreams, it's really worth looking into the points that they're trying to make, especially when you find these characters contrary or disagreeable. And so one way of doing that is to realize that they're speaking in metaphors. They're speaking in symbols. So if you have a dream and your home is being swarmed by bugs, to work on that metaphorically would be to ask questions like, what's bugging me right now? Right? So that's how the deep psyche likes to talk, through symbols. So there are also implications of this I won't go into right now because I want to get to the Q&A if there is any. But implications in terms of how the world shows up. And at Vimeo, I actually have a course on this, how the world shows up in your dreams. So you might want to take a look at that. But imagination isn't just a tool for the use of the conscious mind. It's also a doorway into a much wider reality that we can live in with some sense of play and enchantment. So thanks for being here for this. I hope it was useful. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. But just a reminder of a couple of things. I try to do these every week. I don't always get to it, but usually Fridays at 9 a.m. I'll have something. And probably next week, I'm going to talk about Jung's relationship to nature and depth psychologies as well. So I think I'll go into that a little bit. Might do a couple on that, actually. We'll see how it goes. And just a reminder, if you want to be told about these in advance, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's free. And also, if you want to see a newsletter every month that has events and ideas and reflections, I don't spam people, just once a month. If you go to my website, chalkwist.com, you should see a pop-up that says, you want a newsletter? And say yes, and you'll get it. So, all right, take care, everybody.